Question. There are people who might reach a very high level of consciousness at the end of a lifetime, but do not quite manage to ascend, or who might qualify at the end of it but choose to re-embody for various reasons. What does early life, primarily meaning childhood, look like for such people who come into embodiment at the 143rd level or close to it? Considering we forget our previous lifetimes and that children are affected by various things, is it smooth sailing to the next step, or is there in early life some temporary drop in consciousness a few rungs down, which the lifestream has to climb back up upon rediscovering the spiritual path in that lifetime? Well, it's actually a very interesting question. I just don't have a definitive answer at it because when I was born in this lifetime, I wasn't at the 143rd level of consciousness. But my understanding of it is that you can't give a general answer to this question because it's very individual. So you could say that, especially for people who could have ascended but chose to re-embody, what is their individual reason for wanting to re-embody? What is it they really want to do? And so just to give an extreme example of this, it's my understanding from various spiritual teachings I've studied that there are some beings with a very high level of consciousness that choose to incarnate with very big physical or even mental handicaps. They can be autistic, for example. But at inner levels, they have a very high level of consciousness, but outwardly they seem to be non-functioning. And therefore, many people would think, well, a person like that couldn't have a very high level of consciousness. But in some cases they do, because they are primarily here to hold the spiritual balance for the earth. In other words, by being in physical embodiment, the spiritual light can shine through them into the collective consciousness. And because they don't have the outer faculties that allows them to engage in ordinary life, they are a much better conduit for the light than if they were engaged in all kinds of activities. So this is just one scenario. And so I'm saying there could be a variety of scenarios. But I think there are, of course, some beings with a high level of consciousness that come in. They remember their past lives, for example. Or they may have a very strong intuitive sense that they are here to do something, that the life has a purpose. And but I think that many people, in fact, I think in general, when you are born, the process, it's like your body dies, and your soul, your four lower bodies that constitute you, disentangles itself from the body. But then you have a period in between embodiments where you are learning and growing. But then when you come down into your next embodiment, you have to go through this process of again reintegrating with the physical body. And no matter what your level of consciousness is, this is such a complex process that I think you really lose some awareness of what you knew and what your level of consciousness was before you came into embodiment. So I think there is a certain forgetting that happens, and therefore, in a sense, you start over. You have to reconnect to the spiritual path. But obviously, the higher your level of consciousness before you come into embodiment, the easier it is to get back to this sense of where you were before and what your spiritual purpose is. So I think you can see that there have been some of these highly evolved people that lived a normal childhood, whatever that meant in their particular society and family, and then at a certain age, it was like they were reawakened. I mean, you have Ramana Maharshi, who I think it was the age of 16 where he had his awakening experience. But before that, he had lived a somewhat normal life in India. You have Yogananda, who talks about how he always had certain promptings, but it was really not until he reached a certain age that he met his guru and started the spiritual path. So I think even for people with a high level of consciousness, it's fairly common that you have a pretty normal childhood and teenage years. And then at a certain point, you go through an awakening. And I really don't think it gives any meaning to say that the earlier this happens, the more evolved you are. I think there can be many different scenarios because, again, you know, I said with people being autistic, you can choose to take that on. But you also see people who are actually highly evolved who choose to embody in very, very difficult circumstances. For example, with very dysfunctional families, or in a very difficult society with war or problems like that. Again, it can be partly to hold a spiritual balance, but it can also be perhaps because they have a few illusions they want to overcome themselves, but I think more often it's because they want to give other people an opportunity. So if you embody with an abusive parent, for example, you do this because you want to give that parent an opportunity to deal with a highly evolved and therefore innocent life stream, so that they might come to see this contrast between the abusive behavior and the innocence of the child. So there can be, you know, what I'm saying is that there are highly evolved beings who embody in very difficult circumstances. So I think there are people, spiritual people I've seen over the years who think that the more highly evolved you are, the more easy your life should be. And I just don't think that is the case. And so you could very well have a person who grows up in a very difficult childhood and is affected by this and may even dip in consciousness. But then again, they have a more easy, they can reconnect to the momentum from past lifetimes and therefore more easily overcome it and heal themselves, so that they could still, even though they had a difficult childhood, ascend after this lifetime. So it's an interesting question, as I'm saying. I don't think there's one definitive answer to it, because I think it is really individual. I mean, if you have qualified for your ascension, for example, and choose to stay in embodiment on Earth, you have a reason for doing this. And it is probably either that you want to learn something yourself, or, but more likely, if your consciousness is high, you want to help other people. So there can be people, for example, who choose to remain in embodiment because they want to help manifest Saint Germain's Golden Age. So they are very focused on bringing forth some change in society. And this could mean, for example, I mean, just a scenario, it could mean that you want to bring forth some new scientific discovery, right? Well, in order to do this, you would probably have to get an education as a scientist and go into that field. And that may mean it's not really helpful for you to be aware of the spiritual side of life. It's not necessary for you. So you might not be a spiritual person just because you have a highly evolved level of consciousness, because you are focused on science, or you're focused on politics, or you're focused on whatever. So what I've come to over the years is this, that it's difficult, it's not constructive really to judge with the outer mind what spiritual people should or shouldn't be like. And I try to avoid this, that you can see in spiritual movements where you want to feel that, oh, the guru was so special because he was so special from childhood. Like you have with Jesus, you know. Jesus was born in this high level of consciousness, and the three kings appeared, and there was a star in the sky. You have this myth about the Buddha, who was also born under these very different circumstances. And so there's this myth that's projected that spiritually evolved people should be born and have a very special childhood, or they should have special abilities from childhood. And I don't think that's always the case, is all I'm trying to say.